The thermometer in the kitchen read 78 degrees, but I could see my breath. I'd been standing in front of the old cast-iron stove for 20 minutes, watching frost creep across the inside of the window above the sink. Not condensation. Frost. Delicate fern patterns spreading upward from the sill, growing in real time despite the fact that it was July, and the afternoon sun was pouring through the glass. I touched the window. The frost was on the inside, underneath my fingertips, impossibly cold. When I pulled my hand back, my fingerprints remained in the ice for 3 full seconds before the frost grew over them, erasing the evidence that I'd been there at all. The house was 63 degrees warmer than the air inside it. That's when I heard the sound from upstairs. Not footsteps, but something heavier. The groan of floorboards under weight that had been standing in one place for a very, very long time, finally shifting. And then, cutting through the summer afternoon, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, one breath every 30 seconds, coming from somewhere above me that I knew shouldn't exist. I inherited the house on Chesham Road 3 weeks after Aunt Miriam died. I hadn't seen her in 22 years, not since I was 8, and my mother stopped bringing me to Harrisville for summers. Mom never explained why, just said one August that we weren't going back, and that was the end of it. When I asked about Aunt Miriam, asked if she was sick, if we'd done something wrong, if we'd ever visit again, my mother's face would close like a door, and she'd find something else that needed doing. The lawyer's letter came to my apartment in Portland in late June. The house, 4 acres of woods, and something the letter called attendant obligations were now mine. There was no mention of money, no other family, no explanation of what attendant obligations meant, just an address, a set of keys being held at the law office, and a request that I come to Harrisville, at my earliest convenience to receive full instruction regarding the property's maintenance requirements. I should have asked more questions. I should have called the lawyer back and demanded clarity. But I was 29, working a job I hated, living in a studio apartment that cost too much, and the idea of inheriting a house, even an old house in rural New Hampshire, felt like the kind of luck I'd stopped expecting. I drove down on the first Saturday in July. The highways gave way to state routes, then to county roads that got narrower and more cracked with each turn. Harrisville is barely a town, a cluster of old brick mill buildings along Nubinusett Brook, maybe 75 people still living there year-round, most of them over 60, the kind of place where the general store still has a hand-lettered sign and the gas station closed in 1987. The house sat 2 miles outside the village center, at the end of a dirt road called Chesham that turned to mud every spring and hadn't been graded in what looked like decades. Maples crowded close on both sides, branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel of green shadow. When I finally came around the last curve and saw the house, I had to stop the car and just sit there, hands on the wheel, staring. It was exactly how I remembered it. A colonial, dark red clapboard, central chimney made of fieldstone, 12/12 windows with original glass that made everything outside look slightly liquid and strange. Built in 1783, according to the town records I'd looked up online. Miriam had lived here alone for 47 years, ever since her mother died in 1977, and left her the place. I'd loved this house once. I remembered that as I sat in the driveway, keys from the lawyer heavy in my pocket. I'd loved the huge kitchen fireplace you could stand inside, the narrow back stairs that creaked in specific patterns, the way sound moved through the rooms like something living and curious. I'd loved Aunt Miriam's piano playing in the evenings. She'd play Chopin and Schubert while I sat on the floor with my coloring books, and the old quilts that smelled like cedar, and the rows of preserves in the cellar with their labels in her careful handwriting: strawberry, blueberry, wild grape, year after year after year. I couldn't remember why we stopped coming. That absence sat in my memory like a hole, perfectly shaped, but completely empty. We came every summer until I was 8, then we didn't. My mother never explained. I eventually stopped asking. The key stuck in the front door lock. The wood had swollen with humidity, but the door opened smoothly once I got it turned, the hinges silent and well-oiled. The house exhaled stale air that smelled like dried lavender, and something else underneath, something mineral and cold, like the air in a cave. I stood in the front hall and felt the house settle around me. Not threatening, just aware. Before we continue, subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories like this. Stories these houses were never meant to tell. The furniture was still there, all of it. Miriam's piano against the parlor wall, Sheet music open to Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat. The reading chair by the window with a book face down on the arm. I picked it up and found the bookmark still in place. Page 247 of a biography of Clara Schumann. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, a skin of mold floating on the surface like a tiny gray continent. The calendar on the wall was still turned to March, 3 months before she died. It looked like she'd stepped out for a walk 20 minutes ago and just never came back. I moved through the downstairs rooms slowly, touching things. The banister was smooth under my palm, worn to silk by generations of hands. The floorboards creaked in patterns I remembered. Third board by the stairs, loud. Fifth board near the keeping room door, silent. The house had a language of sound, and my body remembered how to speak it, even though my mind had forgotten. I opened windows, letting in the July air. It poured through the rooms thick and green with summer, carrying the sound of crickets starting their evening song in the long grass. A breeze moved the curtains in the parlor, and somewhere deep in the house, a door closed softly. Just the wind. Had to be. But inside, despite the windows and the summer air, the house felt held, waiting. I couldn't shake the sensation that I'd interrupted something, walked in on a conversation that had been happening for a very long time, and would resume the moment I left. The rooms were arranged exactly the way I remembered, keeping room off the kitchen with its enormous fireplace, still full of ash from what must have been the last fire Miriam built. Parlor with the piano and the portrait of someone's great-grandmother above the mantel. She'd always looked stern to me as a child, but now she just looked tired. Dining room that Miriam had converted into a library, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 3 walls. A reading table in the center covered with more books, medical texts, agricultural manuals, and older books, leather-bound volumes with the pages brittle and brown. I picked one up carefully. It was handwritten, the ink faded to sepia, a ledger of some kind, dated 1791. Lists of supplies purchased. Quart of wood, 3 shillings, salt pork, 1 barrel, nails, various. And then, halfway down a page, materials for the keeping room, as per C. M. S. instruction, iron fixtures, stone from the Northfield, specific dimensions maintained. I didn't know what that meant. I set the book down and went upstairs. The staircase was narrow and steep, the way colonial stairs always were. No room wasted. Every inch of space accounted for and used. I ran my hand along the wall as I climbed, and the plaster was cool and slightly damp despite the heat outside. Not wet, just cool, the way stone stays cool even in summer. When I reached the upstairs hallway, I stopped. My bedroom door was closed. I didn't remember it ever being closed during those childhood summers. Miriam had left all the doors open, she said, to let the house breathe. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the white porcelain knob, and felt the temperature difference. The hallway was warm, stuffy, even, but cold air was seeping out from under the door, rolling across the floor around my feet. I turned the knob and pushed. The hinges made a sound like something breathing, a long, slow exhalation. Everything was exactly where I'd left it 22 years ago. The books on the shelf, Where the Wild Things Are, The Secret Garden, A Wrinkle in Time, the green wool blanket folded at the foot of the narrow bed, the wooden truck I'd played with, still parked on the windowsill where I'd left it the last morning before Mom packed our things and we drove away. Even the drawings I'd made, colored pencil sketches of the house, the woods, the brook where I'd caught tadpoles, were still tacked to the wall above the small desk, their edges curled with age. Miriam had kept it like a shrine, or a promise. Come back, the room said. You always belonged here, but the air was wrong. It was cold, actually cold, not just cool. Cold enough that I could feel it rolling out of the room like water, spilling into the hallway, spreading around my ankles. I stepped inside, and the temperature dropped immediately, shockingly, at least 15 degrees. My arms prickled into goosebumps. I could see my breath, faint but visible, hanging in the air. I looked around for an explanation. The window was closed and latched. No broken panes, no cracks in the plaster, no open heating vents. The house still used the original fireplaces and a wood stove in the kitchen. There was no central heating to malfunction, just cold, as if the room itself had decided to be winter. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to make sense of it. Old houses do strange things. They settle. They shift. Temperature variations happen. Cold pockets where air gets trapped. Warm spots near chimneys. Thermal mass. Stone foundations holding on to cold from spring, releasing it slowly through the summer. Except it was July, peak summer in New Hampshire, and this cold felt deliberate, intentional, like something was maintaining it. That's when I noticed the frost. It started at the corner of the window, so faint I almost missed it. A thin white line growing along the interior edge of the glass, branching out in delicate fern patterns. Not condensation beating up, not moisture from the air, frost, ice, growing from the inside of the window outward, spreading in real time as I watched. I stepped closer. The frost was forming against the warm glass. I could feel the heat from outside radiating through it. The sun was still up, still pouring afternoon light through the window, but the frost didn't care. It grew anyway, spreading upward and sideways, each crystalline branch perfect and mathematical. I watched it spread, slowly at first, then faster, until half the window was covered in patterns so intricate they looked deliberately drawn. The frost caught the sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the floor, across my feet, across the wall. I put my hand near the glass but didn't touch it. The cold radiated outward in waves, and the frost grew toward my palm as if attracted to the warmth. I pulled my hand back and the frost stopped advancing, held in place, waiting. The house was doing this. I knew it with absolute certainty. Not the weather, not some quirk of architecture or airflow. The house was growing ice on the inside of a window in July, and it was doing it because what? Because it wanted to. Because it remembered something. I backed out of the room slowly, watching the frost, and closed the door. In the warm hallway, my heart was beating hard and fast. I could hear it, could feel it in my throat. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, breathing, thinking. Then I opened the door again. The frost was still there, unchanged, perfectly preserved. And as I stood in the doorway, neither inside the room nor outside it, I felt the temperature drop again. Not in the room, in me. A coldness that started in my chest and spread outward, like my body was remembering something my mind had forgotten. When I finally closed the door and went back downstairs, I could hear my heart beating in my ears, too fast and too loud, trying to warm me against something that had nothing to do with temperature. I convinced myself it was thermal shock. The house had been closed up for weeks, since Miriam died in early June, and I'd opened all the downstairs windows at once, creating sudden air currents that pulled cold air up from the foundation through the old walls. Victorian-era houses did this all the time. The rapid introduction of warm, humid air into a space that had been sealed and temperature-stable created condensation, even localized frost, especially in rooms with north-facing windows and stone foundations directly below. I'd read about it in a home repair book once, years ago. Thermal bridging, differential pressure, moisture migration through porous materials. It made sense. It had to make sense. Because the alternative was that a house built in 1783 was growing ice on purpose, and that was insane. I spent the next 3 days sorting through Miriam's things, trying to ignore the fact that my childhood bedroom remained stubbornly, impossibly cold. I wore a jacket when I went in there. I told myself I was being practical, protecting myself from the temperature differential until I could sort out the heating situation. Never mind that it was July and there was no heating to sort out. The house had been maintained immaculately, every hinge oiled to silence, every window glazed and tight, every surface clean enough to see my reflection. Miriam had taken care of this place with a devotion that bordered on religious. The firewood in the keeping room was stacked in precise rows. The preserves in the cellar were organized by year-date, going back decades. Some jars so old the contents had darkened to black. Her records were perfect. 47 years of receipts and notes, all filed by year in a small oak cabinet in the dining room. Firewood deliveries, roof repairs, property taxes, chimney cleaning, a new water pump in 1989, window restoration in 2001. Every expense documented, every date recorded. But there were gaps. Entire years where nothing was recorded. 1989 to 1992, 4 years, completely blank except for a single note that said, winter kept. 2003 to 2007, 5 years missing, with just the words, maintained, held. And the most recent gap, 2018 to 2023, 5 full years with no receipts, no repairs, nothing but a single note in Miriam's handwriting dated December 21st, 2023, kept, held, counted. Still sufficient. I sat at the dining room table with these records spread out in front of me and tried to make sense of the pattern. The gaps weren't random. They occurred in cycles, roughly every 15 years, and they always started in winter. What did "still sufficient" mean? Sufficient for what? I found the photographs in a steamer trunk in the attic. It was hot up there under the roof, the air thick and still, smelling of old wood and insulation. But when I opened the trunk, cold air spilled out like water, and I had to step back. The photographs were in albums, dozens of them, meticulously organized. Most were from the 1960s and 70s. Miriam with my mother and 2 other women I didn't recognize, all of them young, standing in front of the house in summer dresses. Miriam at the piano, her fingers on the keys, looking at the camera with something like sadness. Miriam in the garden, holding a basket of tomatoes. And then, buried at the bottom of the trunk, I found a photograph that stopped me cold. A man standing in front of the house in what looked like late autumn. Bare trees, low gray sky, dead leaves thick on the ground. He wore a heavy coat, dark wool, and his hands were in his pockets. He wasn't smiling. He was just standing there, looking at the camera with an expression I couldn't read. Resignation, maybe, or acceptance. The photograph was dated on the back in faded pencil, November 12, 1976. C.H. Last day. God forgive us. C.H. The initials meant nothing to me, but the date stuck. November 12, 1976. The year before my grandmother died and left the house to Miriam. I took the photograph downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The man's face looked familiar in a way I couldn't place. Something about the way he stood, the set of his shoulders, the shape of his jaw. Family resemblance, maybe. A cousin or uncle I'd never met. I made coffee and sat there looking at the photograph while the afternoon light moved across the table. Outside, cicadas hummed in the heat. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. I realized I couldn't hear any of the normal settling sounds. The creaks, the ticks, the small movements old houses make. It was like the house was holding its breath. That night, I took a cooking thermometer upstairs and measured the temperature in my old bedroom, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. I stood in the doorway, I wouldn't go fully inside anymore, and watched the thermometer's needle hold steady. The rest of the house was 73 degrees. Outside, the July night was humid and thick, tree frogs calling from the woods, heat lightning flickering on the horizon. But in that room, frost covered both windows completely now, thick enough to obscure the view outside. Beautiful, intricate patterns that caught the moonlight and glowed faintly blue. I scraped at it with my fingernail. The frost didn't melt from the heat of my skin. It just fell away in small, crystalline flakes that disappeared before they hit the floor, not melting, but vanishing, like they'd never existed at all. I called a home inspector the next morning. His name was Bill Sanderson. He'd been doing home inspections in the Monadnock region for 30 years. If anyone could explain what was happening, it would be him. He arrived that afternoon in a truck with Sanderson Home Inspections, painted on the side, carrying 2 equipment cases and a thermal camera that looked expensive. I led him upstairs and opened the door to my old bedroom. "Huh," he said, stepping inside without hesitation. He didn't seem to notice the cold. He spent 40 minutes in that room, checked the windows with a moisture meter, reading normal, examined the walls with a stud finder, nothing unusual, ran his thermal camera over every surface, photographing the walls, the floor, the ceiling. "Well," he said finally, looking at his equipment, "I'll be honest with you. I don't see anything wrong." "What do you mean?" "Look at the frost." He looked at the window, then at me, then at the window again. His expression was patient, kind. "What frost?" I turned. The windows were clear, completely clear. Not a trace of ice anywhere, just glass, reflecting the afternoon light. But it was... I stopped. Bill was looking at me with concern now, not skepticism. The kind of look you give someone when you're worried about their mental state. "The house has been closed up for a while," he said gently. And sometimes when people are dealing with grief, with loss, the mind can, well, it can play tricks, see things that aren't quite there. It's normal, natural even. He showed me the thermal camera images. Every surface in the room read between 72 and 75 degrees, perfectly normal, perfectly stable. I paid him, thanked him, and stood in the driveway watching his truck disappear down Chesham Road. Then I went back upstairs. The frost was back, spreading across both windows like something alive. growing in patterns so complex they looked deliberately designed, and the temperature had dropped even further. When I held up the thermometer, it read 38 degrees. The house had lied to Bill, hidden itself, shown him exactly what it wanted him to see, and that's when I understood. The house wasn't just cold. The house was conscious. It knew when to reveal itself and when to hide. It had been doing this for a very long time, and it knew exactly how to protect its secrets. The house was lying. That's what I kept thinking over the next 2 days. The house had shown Bill Sanderson exactly what it wanted him to see. Normal temperatures, clear windows, nothing unusual. And then, the moment his truck disappeared down Chesham Road, it had gone back to being what it actually was. Cold. Impossibly cold in that one room. And getting colder. I started measuring obsessively, 3 times a day, every day. Morning, afternoon, evening. The temperature kept dropping. 41 degrees, 39, 36, 33. The frost on the windows grew thicker, more elaborate. It started spreading to the walls, thin crystalline patterns creeping across the plaster like frost on a window in January. Except it was mid-July, peak summer. The thermometer outside read 92 degrees. I tried everything to warm the room. I brought up a space heater. It ran for 10 minutes and then stopped working. Just died. I built a fire in the keeping room fireplace directly below, hoping heat would rise through the floorboards. The room got colder. I left the door open all day, trying to equalize the temperature with the rest of the house. The cold just spread into the hallway, forcing me to close the door again. The house didn't want that room to be warm. On the 4th day, I started measuring the dimensions. I'd been thinking about architecture, about the way old houses were built. Colonials like this one were constructed around a central chimney, with rooms arranged symmetrically on either side. But something about the upstairs layout had been bothering me. The spaces didn't feel right. The hallway seemed too short. My old bedroom seemed too small. So I measured. I started in my bedroom, 8 feet by 10 feet. The hallway, 22 feet long. The bathroom, 6 by 8. Miriam's bedroom at the other end, 12 by 14. The guest room in the middle, 10 by 12. I added it up. Then I measured the exterior of the house. Then I added it up again. 4.5 feet of space was missing. I went through the measurements 3 more times, checking my math, checking my tape measure, checking everything. Same result. The interior dimensions of the upstairs didn't match the exterior dimensions. Somewhere in the layout, hidden between the rooms or disguised as wall thickness, there was a space roughly 4.5 feet wide running most of the length of the house. Old houses have weird voids sometimes. Spaces that result from renovations, from chimneys being removed, from attic stairs being relocated. It happens. But this felt deliberate. I started tapping on walls. In the guest room, everything sounded solid. In the bathroom, solid. In my old bedroom, too cold to stay in for long, solid. But in Miriam's bedroom, along the wall that should have backed up to the guest room, there was a section that sounded hollow, different. I tapped my way along the plaster, listening to the sound change from solid to void and back to solid again. The hollow section was about 3 feet wide. It ran from floor to ceiling, and when I examined the wall closely, I found something I'd missed before. A thin vertical line in the plaster, perfectly straight, almost invisible, unless you were looking for it. Not a crack, a seam. Deliberately plastered over, but still there, still visible if you knew what you were looking for. It took me 20 minutes to find how to open it. The trigger was in the decorative molding near the floor, a small wooden rosette that looked like pure ornament. But when I pressed it and twisted slightly to the left, something inside the wall clicked, and a section of plaster swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it, stairs, narrow, steep stairs going up into darkness. I'd lived in this house for 3 summers as a child. I'd explored every room, every closet, every corner. I'd never known there was an attic access here. I'd never known there was an attic at all, beyond the small crawl space under the roof peaks that held nothing but insulation. I got my flashlight and climbed. The stairs were new, or newish, definitely not original to the house. The wood was smooth, the angles precise, the construction professional. Someone had built these stairs carefully, recently, within the last 50 years maybe. At the top was a short hallway, then another door. This one was newer too. Modern, actually. Heavy steel with a keypad lock that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. A keypad lock. In an attic. In a house built in 1783. I tried the handle anyway, just to confirm what I already knew. Locked. The keypad had 6 digits, numbers 0 through 9 above, and a small LED that pulsed slowly, waiting for input. I stood there in the hidden stairway, in the dark, listening. There was a sound coming from behind the steel door. Faint, rhythmic, barely audible. At first I thought it was the house settling. Old buildings make noises, especially in temperature changes. But this was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like breathing, slow breathing, so slow it almost didn't sound human. One breath every 30 seconds, deep and even, like someone in a very deep sleep. I put my hand on the steel door. It was cold, actually cold. The coldest thing I'd touched since the frost in my bedroom window. Cold enough that my palm stuck slightly when I pulled it away. Whatever was making the house cold, whatever was generating the impossible frost, it was behind this door. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just listening to that slow, rhythmic breathing. Then I went back downstairs, closed the hidden panel, and sat at the kitchen table with my heart racing. The house wasn't just hiding a space. It was hiding something that breathed, something that needed to be kept cold, something important enough that someone, Miriam, probably, had installed a steel door with a digital lock to keep it contained, or to keep it preserved. I thought about the photograph. November 1976. C.H. Last day. I thought about Miriam's note. Kept, held, counted, still sufficient. And I thought about the gaps in her records, the missing years, the times when nothing was documented except maintenance, holding, counting. 47 years. Miriam had lived alone in this house for 47 years, maintaining something she kept hidden behind a steel door in a secret attic room, maintaining something that was still breathing. The keypad required 6 digits. I tried everything I could think of. Miriam's birthday, 081930, nothing. The year the house was built, 001783, nothing. Random combinations, 111111, 11123456, 0, 0. The keypad just beeped once, dismissive, and the LED continued its slow pulse. I went back through her files, looking for numbers, dates, codes, anything that might be 6 digits. I found bank account numbers, but they were too long. I found property tax ID numbers, but they didn't work. I found phone numbers, measurements, receipts with totals that could be read as numbers, but none of them opened the door. Then I found the ledger. It was in the dining room cabinet, buried under 40 years of other records. A small leather-bound book, old, with pages that crackled when I turned them. Inside was a list of dates, each one written in different handwriting, going back to 1791. Most entries were just dates and brief notes. Winter held, J, S, counted, cold maintained, R, W, kept, sufficient, M, P, continued. But one entry was different. November 12th, 1976, the same date as the photograph, written in Miriam's handwriting. Clarence Hammond. Began. God forgive us all. November 12th, 1976, 11:02:76. I went back up the hidden stairs, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. My hands were shaking when I entered the code. The keypad beeped twice. The lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. The steel door swung open on smooth hinges, and a wave of cold air rolled out that was so intense it hurt to breathe. I should have left. I should have closed that door, locked it, walked away, driven back to Portland and hired someone to sell this house without ever asking what it contained. Should have listened to the part of my brain that was screaming at me to run. But I stepped inside instead. The room was maybe 8 feet square, just like I'd estimated. The walls were lined with something that looked like insulation, silver and thick. The floor was concrete. There were no windows, no vents, nothing that connected to the outside world. And the temperature. I could see my breath crystallizing in the flashlight beam, could feel my skin tightening in the cold. In the center of the room was a chair, an old wooden chair, plain and sturdy, facing the corner. And sitting in it, back to the door, perfectly still, was a figure, not sitting, held. The figure was covered in frost, not just dusted with it, but encased in it, a shell of ice that had grown over every surface, clothes, skin, hair, until nothing organic was visible anymore. Just ice, shaped like a human being, sitting absolutely motionless in a chair. But it was breathing. I could see it, the chest rising and falling in the thinnest possible motion. One breath every 30 seconds, so shallow the ice barely moved, just a tiny expansion and contraction that caught the light. I stepped closer, my feet crunching on the frost that covered the concrete floor. The figure was wearing a heavy wool coat, dark pants, work boots, the clothes from the photograph, the same clothes. When I moved around to see the face, what should have been the face, I found it completely covered in ice. But underneath, visible through the crystalline shell like something preserved in amber, I could see features: strong jaw, prominent nose, high forehead, the same bone structure as Miriam, the same family resemblance I'd seen in the photograph. Clarence Hammond, her older brother, sitting here, frozen, breathing once every 30 seconds, since November 12th, 1976. 48 years. There was a journal on the floor beside the chair, held shut with a leather strap. The leather was so cold it stuck to my fingers when I picked it up. I had to pry it free carefully, leaving bits of my skin behind. I took it downstairs. My hands were numb. My face hurt from the cold. I built a fire in the keeping room fireplace even though it was July, even though the day outside was sweltering. I needed heat, needed warmth, needed to feel like the world still made sense. The journal belonged to Clarence. The entries were dated, starting in September 1976. He'd been sick. Leukemia, the doctors said. Terminal. They gave him 6 months, maybe 8, if he was lucky. He was 34 years old, but Clarence had found something. Papers hidden in the chimney during a repair, sealed in a metal box. Colonial-era documents written in careful script, describing what the original builder had discovered and built into this house. I read it 3 times, trying to understand. The original owner, a man named Josiah Sears, had lost his son to fever in the winter of 1786. Lost him and couldn't accept it, so Josiah had done something, built something, used materials from specific places, assembled them in specific ways, following instructions that he claimed came from older knowledge, practiced before the first stone was laid in this new land. He built the house to remember, not just to stand as a monument, but to actually remember. To hold memory in its wood and stone and mortar the way ice holds air bubbles, the way amber holds insects. To preserve things in a state between living and dying, suspended in perpetual cold. The house learned to keep things. Josiah's son, frozen, preserved, had been the first, kept in the cold room for 3 years before Josiah finally accepted that preservation wasn't the same as life, that holding wasn't the same as having. He'd let the boy finish, let him die, and then spent the rest of his life maintaining the house's ability, making sure it stayed dormant, waiting for someone desperate enough to use it again. That person had been Clarence. The final entries in his journal explained everything. October 15, 1976. I don't want to die at 34. I don't want to have 6 months. I want more time. The house can give me that. The house can hold me. October 23, 1976. Told Miriam. She understands. She doesn't agree, but she understands. She'll maintain it. Count the time. And when it's enough, when I've had what I needed, she'll let me finish. November 12, 1976. Last entry. After this, the house takes over. Miriam will count, 1 week at a time. Mark each one. And someday, when the count is enough, she'll know to end it. But until then, I'll be here, held, kept, preserved in winter. The house will remember me. The house will give me the time I never got. If you're still listening, you're already part of this house. I found Miriam's journals in the secretary desk in the parlor. Not the record-keeping ledgers, but personal journals. Thin, leather-bound books filled with her small, precise handwriting. 47 years of them, arranged chronologically on the shelf. I started with 1977, the year after Clarence went into the cold. For 47 years, my aunt had climbed those hidden stairs once a week to check on her brother. Every Tuesday, without fail. She documented each visit with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. She counted. Week 1, still held, temperature stable at 28 degrees, C, H, breathing regular, 1 breath per 30 seconds. Week 2, frost thickening on walls, adjusted insulation per original instructions, C, H, unchanged. Week 3, power outage during storm, generator held, temperature maintained, C, H, safe, on and on. Week after week, year after year. I sat at the dining room table with 47 years of journals spread out in front of me, and I counted the marks. Small vertical lines in groups of 5, like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. 52 weeks per year, 47 years, 2,444 weeks, 2,444 times. Miriam had climbed those stairs, opened that steel door, and stood in that freezing room looking at her brother encased in ice, checking to make sure he was still breathing, still held, still preserved in the moment before death. The journals weren't just records, they were confessions. Week 241, 1981. Mother asked about Clarence today, told her he was at peace, not entirely a lie. He's suspended. Is that peace? I don't know anymore. Week 503, 1986. Sometimes I hear him in the house, not sounds, just presence, like he's walking the rooms in the moments between my visits. I know that's impossible. He's held, frozen, but the house remembers him too, and sometimes I think it lets him move through its memory. Week 847, 1992. 16 years. He wanted 6 months. I keep asking the house if it's enough, if he's had his time. The house doesn't answer. Or maybe it does, and the answer is that time doesn't work the same way when you're frozen. Maybe he's lived 100 years in there, or maybe he's lived no time at all. Week 1, 203, 2000. Found his medical records today. The doctors were wrong. He wouldn't have lasted 6 months. He would have had 3 weeks. 3 weeks of pain and deterioration. So what are we doing up there? Giving him time, or denying him peace? Week 1, 889, 2013. I'm 73 years old. I've spent more time counting Clarence's frozen weeks than I spent with him when he was warm. Every Tuesday for 37 years. What does that make me? Guardian, jailer, sister. I don't know anymore. The entries grew shorter as the years progressed. Less reflection, more routine, like she was wearing down, becoming nothing but the act of counting. Week 2, 156, 2018. Temperature spike during heat wave. House held anyway. C. H. Breathing unchanged. Sometimes I think the house is stronger than any of us. It will keep him forever if we let it. Week 2, the 339, 2021. COVID year, couldn't visit for 3 months. Terrified the whole time. When I finally climbed the stairs, he was exactly the same. The house doesn't care about pandemics. It just keeps what it's told to keep. Week 2, 401, 2022. 82 years old today. Started making arrangements. Someone will need to continue after I'm gone. Can't let the count just stop. Can't let Clarence finish without knowing someone chose to end it, not just abandoned it. And then, the final entry. Week 2, 444. 3 weeks before she died. Week 2, 444, 2024. I'm tired. The house feels tired. But the pact holds. It always holds. I've contacted the lawyer. Made sure the inheritance is clean. Someone will come. Someone always comes when a house needs them. They'll continue the count. Or they'll decide to end it. Either way, Clarence will have his answer. 48 years. That's not 6 months. That's not even close. But maybe it's enough. Maybe it was always enough, and we just couldn't see it. I sat there with the journals, with the weight of 48 years pressing down on me, and understood what my mother had figured out that last summer. She'd found out what Miriam was doing. Maybe she'd seen the hidden stairs, or maybe she'd just noticed the pattern. Miriam disappearing every Tuesday, always at the same time, always for exactly 15 minutes. Maybe she'd asked questions and gotten answers she couldn't accept, and she'd taken me away to protect me, to make sure I never had to make the choice Miriam had made, to spend a lifetime maintaining someone else's fear of death, to count weeks for someone who'd been too afraid to face their ending, who'd chosen preservation over peace. But now Miriam was gone, and the count had fallen to me. I went back up to the cold room that night, stood in the doorway. I still couldn't bring myself to go fully inside, and looked at Clarence Hammond sitting in his chair, breathing his impossible breaths. The journal said he'd wanted 6 months. Time to finish things. He'd written. Time to say goodbye properly. Time to prepare. He'd gotten 48 years. How long was enough? When did preservation become cruelty? When did keeping become imprisonment? I could open the insulation, strip it from the walls, let warm air flood in, let biology complete what it had started in 1976, let Clarence finish his dying, the way he would have 48 years ago if he'd just let go. Or I could do what Miriam had done. Climb these stairs every Tuesday, check the temperature, verify the breathing, make my marks in a new journal. Week 2545, Week 2446, week 2447. Keep counting until I was old and tired and passing this burden to someone else. The house waited for my decision. I could feel it waiting, patient and cold and infinitely capable of holding whatever I asked it to hold. It had held Clarence for 48 years. It could hold him for 48 more, for 100 years, forever. That was the terrible thing I finally understood. The house didn't have an opinion. It wasn't cruel or kind. It was just capable. It would keep Clarence frozen until someone made the choice to let him go. And if no one ever made that choice, it would keep him until the house itself collapsed into ruins. The burden wasn't the keeping. The burden was the choosing. And Miriam had left that choice to me. I stayed. I told myself it would just be temporary. Just until I understood what Clarence would have wanted. Just until I figured out the right choice. A few weeks, maybe a month. Then I'd decide. But weeks became months. Summer ended, and I was still there. Autumn came to Harrisville in shades of gold and rust, the maples around the house turning colors so bright they hurt to look at. And every Tuesday afternoon, I climbed those hidden stairs. Week 2445, still held. Temperature 28 degrees. C. H. Breathing regular. Week 2146, first frost outside. Temperature inside unchanged. C. H. Breathing regular. Week 2447, temperature stable. C. H. Breathing regular. I learned the house's rhythms. How it held cold in its bones even when I ran the heat downstairs. How frost bloomed on my bedroom windows when I spent too long in the attic. How the temperature throughout the entire structure would drop 3 degrees if I was even a day late with my weekly check. Not a threat, just a reminder. The house wanted consistency. The house needed the count. I started talking to Clarence sometimes, telling him about the repairs I was making, new shingles on the south side, the cellar steps reinforced, the kitchen window reglazed. I told him about the garden I was planning for spring, about the way the light looked through the old windows in late afternoon, about the deer that came to eat the apples from the tree behind the house. He never answered, of course, but his breathing continued, one breath every 30 seconds, regular as a metronome. Winter came early that year. November brought snow that didn't melt, accumulating in the woods around the house, muffling everything until the world felt wrapped in silence. The house settled into the cold, like something coming home. The temperature in the cold room dropped slightly, from 28 degrees to 26. Clarence's breathing slowed to match, one breath every 33 seconds now. I checked the original instructions that Miriam had carefully transcribed and stored in a waterproof box in the cold room. The breathing would continue to slow as winter deepened. At the solstice, it would be 1 breath per minute. Then, as the days lengthened, it would speed up again. The house breathed with the seasons, and Clarence breathed with the house. I was sick in December. Just a cold, nothing serious. Fever, chills, congestion. I took medicine, drank tea, tried to rest, but on the 3rd night, I woke up freezing. Not just cold. The same impossible cold I'd felt that first day in my childhood bedroom. I stumbled to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. There was frost in my hair. Actual frost. Small crystals forming at the tips of each strand, catching the light, and my breath. I could see it crystallizing in the air. Tiny ice particles forming and falling like microscopic snow. My breathing had changed. Slowed. I could feel it. The pause between inhale and exhale was longer than it should have been. Deeper. Like I was falling into rhythm with something else. The house wasn't just keeping Clarence. It was learning to keep me too. I stood in front of that mirror, watching frost spread across the glass from the inside, watching my breath turn to ice in the air, and finally understood what attendant obligations meant, what Miriam's note had really said. Kept, held, counted, still sufficient. Sufficient, not complete, not finished. Sufficient to maintain the house's ability. Sufficient to keep the cold strong enough to hold one person completely. But the house needed more than just what it could take from Clarence. It needed someone warm to balance someone frozen, someone living to anchor someone suspended. It needed the counter as much as it needed what was being counted. Miriam had been that balance for 47 years. She'd fed the house her warmth, her time, her life, slowly, gradually. So slowly she probably didn't notice until it was too late. The house had taken a little more each year, a little more cold seeping into her bones, a little more of her breathing slowing to match the rhythm of her Tuesday climbs. She'd needed me not just to take over the counting. She'd needed me to take her place in the equation, to become the warm thing that let the house keep the cold thing, to feed it what it needed so it could continue doing what it had always done. And I'd stayed. I'd climbed those stairs every Tuesday. I'd let the house learn my rhythms, my breathing, my presence, and now it was starting to hold me the way it held Clarence, slowly, gently, but inevitably. I could leave, right now, tonight, drive back to Portland, let the house stand empty, let Clarence finally finish what he'd started 48 years ago. But I knew what would happen if I did. The cold would spread, not just through the house, but outward, into the foundation, the ground, the woods. The house had learned too well how to remember, how to hold, how to keep things in winter. It had been doing it for over 200 years. Without someone to maintain the boundary, without someone to count and contain it, the cold wouldn't just stay in that one room. Harrisville would become a place where winter never ended, where frost grew on the inside of every window, where the brook froze solid even in July, where the cold reached out and out and out until someone finally came and learned to count again. The house didn't do this out of malice. It did it because it was built to remember, and it had learned that cold was how you preserved things. It would protect that knowledge the only way it knew how, by making sure the cold never stopped. I went to the cold room that night, opened the steel door and stepped fully inside for the first time. The cold hit me like a wall, but I walked through it to stand in front of Clarence. "I understand now," I said, my voice crystallizing in the air. The house heard me. I felt it hear me in the way the temperature stabilized, the way the frost on the walls brightened slightly, catching light that wasn't there. "I'll keep counting." Clarence didn't respond, but his next breath came exactly 33 seconds later, precise and eternal. That was 3 years ago. I climb the stairs every Tuesday. I check the temperature. I verify the breathing. I make my mark in a new journal that sits beside Miriam's 47 volumes. Week 2601, Week 2602, Week 263. The house keeps Clarence in his perpetual November, one breath every 33 seconds, frozen in the moment before death found him. And slowly, gently, inevitably, it's learning to keep me too. My breathing has slowed. Not much. Not enough for anyone else to notice if they were here, which they aren't. But I notice. One breath every 12 seconds now, where it used to be every 4. By next year it will be 15. The year after, 20. The frost in my bedroom window doesn't melt anymore. Even in summer, some mornings I wake up and find crystalline patterns growing across my pillow, tiny ice formations that vanish when I touch them. I'm 32 years old. Clarence was 34 when he sat down in that chair. I have time. The house will make sure I have all the time I need. And when I'm ready, when I've had enough, when the counting becomes too much, when my breathing slows to match Clarence's and I can't fight it anymore, I'll take my place in the cold room. I'll sit in a chair facing the corner. I'll let the house remember me. I'll let it hold me in winter. And someone else will inherit this house on Chesham Road. Someone else will climb these stairs and find 2 figures frozen in ice, breathing once per minute on the winter solstice. Someone else will read the journals and understand what attendant obligations means. Someone else will count, because the house always finds someone to remember. The house always finds someone who's desperate enough, or curious enough, or kind enough to stay. And once you start counting, once you let the house learn your rhythms and your breathing and your warmth, you can't leave, because leaving means the cold spreads. Leaving means Harrisville becomes winter forever. So I stay, I count, and I wait for my breathing to slow enough that I can finally stop. The house where winter stays is patient. It has all the time in the world. And now, so do I. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories about houses that hide what no one wanted to face.